I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which we all meet, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And in consideration that this is a virtual event and all the network infrastructure traverses global Indigenous lands in which it has been disrupted and continues to be disrupted by all this network infrastructure that we rely upon. So I'll hand over to you, Jason. Won't introduce yourself, Nathan. Jason from the co-director of Information Systems for Social Impact Research Group at Swinburne University of Technology, based in Melbourne. Jason, I'll leave it up to you.
Okay, thank you, Matt, and welcome to 15 other people. So perhaps maybe even drop your names and where you're located in the chat. That'd be good, so we can sort of have a look back after this to see where we've all come from. We are sort of dispersed around the world. I'm currently in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. I am back on campus. I had to get permission and approval to come in because we're in our 6th lockdown at the moment, up to about 130 plus days since March last year. So I'm currently on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, so I'd like to acknowledge my respect and to the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting, and pay my respects to those elders past, present, and those who are also emerging. If I just share the slides across, and we'll get into this. I probably over-engineered the presentation, and Katina will probably smile at this. I've probably got too many slides, and we'll see how we need to speed up. So Matt, as my timekeeper, crack the whip on me as we go through. Just get the slideshow running. So on the title slide, this is actually an image from 2014. It's from the Australian cartoonist Simon Kneebone, and he drew it in response to the boats of asylum seekers and those on the road to refuge coming in about 2014 into Australia, mainly from Indonesia, looking to get asylum into Australia. Now, where a person's identified as being from, where they are, can have real devastating impacts upon them once you start to locate and the metadata around the geocoding of who they are, where they come from, the time and the place. So that's what I'm going to be looking at through the markers of people, places, and time. The presentation's heavy on imagery, looks at the implications around those people, place, and time. And it's not based on a white paper or a recent journal article. It's based on about 15 years or more, 25 years, I think, on my lived experience working in the field. So I think it's important that we actually understand my worldview, where I'm coming from, the lenses for the presentation, because I'm not a geospatial expert in no way. So my DNA is I'm an ethnographer. I love to be in the field. That's my comfort zone. I'm very much comfortable with those who are probably less fortunate, less advantaged than us. And so I've transitioned really from a border protection career, looking at how maybe a government and a regime would look at people like refugees, asylum seekers, and I've transitioned that across into academia. So I'm a local global. I work traditionally with refugees, internally displaced persons here in Australia, diaspora around the world, particularly from the African diaspora. A lot of projects at the moment with the Somali communities. But my comfort zone, as I said, I'm in the field, looking at a lot of the SDGs now around goals 4, 5, and 15. So quality education, gender equity, and life on land. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. More of a sociologist / anthropologist wrapped in a technical wrapper. And you can see from the PhD, not a traditional sort of tech PhD because it was out of the Faculty of Education and Social Work, but I am information systems academic. All right, so just quickly through maybe the next 20 minutes or so, the most important part of what I wanted to do is do a real-time crowdsourcing ideas gathering about what sort of implications, what sort of constructs should we be focusing on if we're looking at the humanitarian side of putting a geocode. So I'm going to look at a couple of examples that I've studied, and the last two, the Karens and the Adivasi in India, which I've been heavily engaged in since about 2010. Then I'm going to look at quickly the digital aid framework, which came out early 2000s. And out of that, we'll be able to see the wrapper, and that's where our constructs together as a community here, community of practice in this session, we'll be able to actually put our words and terms in, which we think would be a good way to have a holistic consideration when we're starting to put frameworks together about humanitarian crises, how to go about it. And finish off with a compelling story about David Dushman and somebody who really was at the center of people, place and time in history. So core constructs, refugees and oppressed populations. When we think about refugees, it's certainly become a politicized term, but it's someone who's been unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin, owing to a couple of very good reasons. Well-founded fear of persecution based on their race, their religion, their nationality. The people who have fled war, violence, conflict and persecution, and the key point is they've actually crossed an international border. This is different to the internally displaced who are still inside their country. And I think Christine talked about Hurricane Katrina, and there was a lot of misinformation about people moving from Louisiana into Texas as being refugees. They actually weren't, according to the definition from the UN Convention. They were internally displaced people. Nearly 83 million refugees at the moment. That's a lot of people. The biggest crises at the moment around Syria, Venezuela, which is surprising, and around Burma, Myanmar, comes in about third or fourth, and that's one of the case studies I'm going to look at. The key protocols are the 1951 Convention on Refugees and the 1967 Protocol. So they're the legal documents around. Now, refugees don't just take time to decide, hey, let's sort of head off to a third country. Let's move away from where we are. It can be quite quick and they have to flee. So the identity of them as they gather up their identity documents can be quite rushed and it can happen quite quickly, going from being an oppressed population and needing to get onto that road of refuge pretty quickly. So the image you can see here is asylum seekers, and that's connected from the Refugee Convention into the UN Declaration of Human Rights, because everybody does have the right to seek asylum. Now, oppressed populations, well, this can be based on institutional power, can be economics, but it's really about creating a system that regularly and severely discriminates against one person or against a group. So apart from the institutional government types and dimensions, oppression of citizens, it can also take on social and economic dimensions as well. The universal element, regardless of the dimension, is that the oppressors are trying to impose their will on others. Now you can start to see if you are using tools and mobile phones, putting out messages against the authoritarian figures. You can expect, in certain cases, the paramilitary, a knock on the door, and a lot of reasons why then you would feel the need to move across the international border for your protection. So the oppressor's tools are prohibition of assembly, free speech, other things like the free media. These are oppressed. And actions can range from imprisoning to killing the activists and other leaders who are considered a threat to the power of the authoritarian figures. So fleeing oppression is a common trigger for a refugee. So let's put this constructs into some sort of a humanitarian context. Now, focusing on a case study, and one of my interests was looking at humanitarian crises pre the digital revolution, the World Wide Web, and then have a look at how these crises have been transformed with the use or technology enabled post the World Wide Web. So if we look at Sarajevo here, Bosnia-Herzegovina, if you look at the Lonely Planet Guide, sounds a great place to visit. But in a moment, we're going to geocode and put a layer across Sarajevo and Bosnia. So the guidebook would tell us it's fantastic. Why not come here and visit? You know, deep, unassuming human warmth, beautiful mountains, numerous medieval castles and ruins, you know, waterfalls. It sounds like a great place to go. And it probably is now. But if we go back in time and look at the Balkan crisis, what we're going to see with the overlap of geocodes, it's going to tell us a far different story. So what are we looking at here? It's really the process of collection of 500 individual and mass graves as part of the Balkan crisis, the Balkan Wars. So this came out of 137 forensic reports from the Physicians for Human Rights and data collected between 97 and 99. So a lot of this work, the geocoding, it was to support the International Criminal Tribunal and the International Red Cross as well, working with forensics teams who were doing the exhumations of the graves. So just look at the number of red geolocators there, all throughout Bosnia. And if you do a bit of research, look at Srebrenica massacre, those sort of things, events, you can see the top image here. It's a British intel officer looking at identity documents piled up as thousands, 10,000s or more, the Serbians, Bosnians, as they went into civil war. Take away the identity documents, how can you tell a story through geocoding? Here's a perfect example that the Open Society Archives has been able to do. Now, if we look at the benefits, I guess, how this has sort of come about, we follow the rabbit down the rabbit hole. The power of geocoding, if we think, okay, mid-1990s, 95, what was the role of the citizen in gathering the data? We didn't have really the smartphones with the video and the text capabilities. What we had was GPS, Google Earth a bit later on, and we were able to then now store the images up into the cloud. But around the early 2000s, we had OpenStreetMap, for example, 2004, that came out. 2008 was Ushahidi, so looking at using the power of mapping tools around the elections and the violence out of Kenya, 2008. And then with the OpenStreetMaps, businesses, organisations came on board and started to use it. So Oxford University, for example, was one of the first businesses to get on board. Crisis mappers, they started to emerge around 2010. So that was with the Haiti earthquake. And then if you think again about the devices around 2010, what did we have access to as citizens to be able to use the open source and do the user-generated content into these systems? It was probably a thing a bit like the iPhone 4 at the time. So again, around the 2010s, we had the Arab Spring. So you're looking at the series of anti-government protests, the uprisings, citizen activists as well. And if I just move away my little presentation because it's blocking what I need to see. In 2011, Time magazine, in their annual Person of the Year, actually named the protester, because these were the ones who were using the tools to gather information and do a lot of about what Steve Mann was talking about, the inverse surveillance. It was really the watched watching the watchers, doing a reverse type with surveillance looking down. The protester was actually able to use the tools to look up. Now, everyone seemed to have a device at the time, and everybody was jumping on board this sort of citizen coding idea. So what was really missing was the idea of frameworks, regulations, principles, policies, frameworks, again, to maybe put a bit of governance around this. So the strict regulatory regime was probably not really needed, but because that would go against the ethos of the open source of crisis mapping, but some sort of structure was necessary. And the Global Brief, which is a Canadian-based international affairs magazine, was highly critical of crisis mappers. And they took aim at them quite well by suggesting that maybe crisis mappers needed a moral compass around 2010, because a little bit of the Wild West, anything could sort of go, could happen. So best practices have emerged, and they sort of split between the process, the transactional way to collect data, how to put into a database. And then on the other side is more about the ethical oversight of how we go about collecting the data. And it's the second path that really is the interest of this presentation. So what you can need to see here, and the need is to really consider the humanitarian aspect of collecting the data. So at the core of the coupling of the people, place and time, I believe, needs to be the intangible concept around humanity. So, but intangibles are difficult to code, right? Kindness, mercy, sympathy when you give and receive it, but they're not tangible things, right? They're not things that you can feel when you drop them on your toe. They're not physical things. And humanitarianism, again, politicized, because it's informed by the variety of the ethical principles, the religious, the cultural, the humanist beliefs. And you've got your global level agreements and the International Declaration of Human Rights as well. But if we're to try and understand how to geocode our humanity, then the first step is to have an understanding of what we actually mean by the term. So things like kindness, empathy, goodwill, benevolence, sympathy, generosity, mercy, these start to emerge out of the literature. So how do we experience humanity as practitioners? How do we get out amongst it? Well, I believe, again, you've got to get out of your comfort zone. And so you can see the image on the right. That's me out of my comfort zone as somebody who grew up in regional New South Wales, country New South Wales. Here's an image of me out in Mumbai, but around the Kalbadevi neighbourhood near Crawford Market, South Mumbai region. And you can see the Jama Masjid in the background, the mosque. So the way to bring our humanity into the equation when we're working with individuals and communities, again, I believe, is what I'd call the handshake protocol. You don't need to do it physically if you're in a different country, a different location, but you can still have empathy around what does it mean to have that physical connection through shaking hands, or in the Muslim context, it can be, the hand over the heart, it can be the namaste, my soul understands or honors your soul. So it's these sort of human connections I think need to be understood and considered by anybody who's starting to geocode. Again, putting the people, the place, and the time together. Simple example here. You can look at the two images, the main one of Nick Anderson, the handshake and the little rose flower, I think it is. The two smiles, that shows you that there's empathy, there's understanding, between those two people in that image. But that doesn't just happen overnight. It goes through longitudinal trust building, relationship building. And that's the hard part. And you can see Ravi and me at the top right-hand corner as well. It's the handshake. Now, my PhD was on the Thai-Burma border. Here's a photo from May 2010. My research was looking at accredited higher education delivery into a refugee camp. And my focus was on the Karen refugees. Now, Forced Migration Review and the Refugee Studies Centre in Oxford, they've got a policy where they don't show, or they show sort of blurred versions of refugees. I've decided to show the full face of a refugee here. I'm not going to say his name. And if you look at the codes, the latitude, longitude, Google Earth, and what 3 words I've got there, it's not actually giving you the location of that building where I'm hugging and having that again, the handshake protocol with that particular refugee. The reason being, there's a lot of privacy issues and other considerations around the danger, possibly, to the research, to the participants, to the Australian Catholic University Study Centre, which is that building, because that refugee has come out of an official refugee camp and is staying for a couple of days or weeks at a time in the study centre, which is really just a house near Maysop. So again, Forced Migration Review is saying it's about dignity, it's about being able to try and share someone's image that's not going to damage them in some way. But I think it's important here to show the two faces involved in that personal one-on-one connection. My current research and field work since 2014, the slide here says 2016, but I've actually been visiting the place of Zamnia since 2014. And this is about the tribal indigenous, the Adivasi of India. At the top left, you can see the Grand Sarpanch, the village community elder. And again, that photo was taken a couple of years of relationship building. But the Adivasi in India have been threatened with expulsion out of the forest that they live in. And so we need to build them a digital footprint in co-design collaboration with them. But a lot of the claims that have been rejected have been around a lack of satellite imagery. So we're actually showing in the bottom 2 photos here, the community, what their community looks like from above, because they've never seen from above. They're not digitally literate, they don't have computers, they don't have smartphones. So what we're trying to do is do oral histories. We're trying to get them to just circle on the map where they live, where they work, where they go, the main features of their village. The main issue here is, and a great quote from Dragana, how do the people that we work with, we participate in, that we geocode, how do they actually feel about their data being collected? Because rarely are they asked. No one is asking them. And that's an important part of what we need to do. So the Digital Aid Framework came out the early 2000s, looking at the complete life cycle of a humanitarian crisis, such as a refugee crisis. Looking at the different stages, which was the framework, the planning before, getting your staff ready, getting into the field during the implementation, what was happening with the end-to-end in the refugee relief cycle, and then getting back home out of the crisis and evaluating how we could do it better. There's a lot of depth in there, and I'll put up a couple of links to papers in a moment or later on. But really the important part for today's breakout room session is around the wrapper. And back in 2002 and 3, the sort of framework wrappers, the ideas, the concepts I was thinking about were things like morals, ethics, the mandates. So who says that a government or another country can simply go in, or an NGO can just go into a country to help out. Other things as well, again, move the slide. Best practices, there are a ton of relief standards. Sphere is maybe the most well-known one. Best practice, accountability. But what I'm hoping to do in the next couple of minutes is to get you, the audience, to start to think about what sort of items, what are those intangibles that we can add in here into the wrapper to have a better understanding about what's going to give us a better holistic view. I think we're going to get taken out of a breakout room in a moment.
We might be. Someone's possibly hit the trigger finger, but don't let that rush you. If we get thrown out, we'll come back in.
All right. So if you've got a phone on you or a tablet or something else, if you just go to www.menti.com and put in that code, I'll be able to see on my other slide, my other screen, the word cloud that's going to develop out of the words that we're going to put in. It's quite simple, so keep it simple, stupid type process. And then I'll return to the presentation and I'll show you the word cloud that's evolving as we start to type them in.